The Chicken Asylum, an Alex Reynolds mystery. Author, Fred Hunter. Publisher, St. Martin's, Griffin, New York. Narrator, Eric Aust. Chapter 5. James was full of innocent smiles at breakfast the next morning as he whipped through his bacon and eggs. He looked so happy and angelic it was hard to believe he was an evil insurgent bent on taking over our country. Mother, Peter, and I spent the meal exchanging glances and giving discreet nods in his direction. They seemed to have decided by tacit agreement that it was up to me to broach the subject of the phone call. Since I was the one who'd seen him making it, even as focused as James was on his food, he eventually noticed what was going on. He stopped eating abruptly and stared at us. "Something is wrong." Mother and Peter looked at me. I cleared my throat. No, of course not. I was just wondering if you knew anyone in America." There was a beat, and he said, "Why do you ask this?" "Well, at the bar, when you went to the bathroom, I happened to see you on the phone." "You watch me?" he said, clearly distressed at the idea. No, it's just you were gone a long time, and we were worried about you. So I went to see if you were all right." He seemed to accept this. It was several seconds before he realized that we were all still waiting for him to answer the question. He tapped his fork against the table a few times, looking down at the cloth. I wished I didn't feel like he was trying to come up with something. Finally, he looked at me. I have, he bit his lower lip. "I don't know the word English." "The word for what?" Mother crooked her eye at me. "Darling, if he knew what, he wouldn't be searching for the word." "Maybe that interpreter, Bagnold, can help," Peter said. "No," James said loudly. "No, please. I have a father, a brother, son." "Your whole family is here," I exclaimed. "No," he replied with frustration. Then he drew an invisible line in the air with his index finger as he repeated, "Father, brother, son." For a moment we were at a loss, then Mother brightened. "Of course! You have a cousin here in the States." "Cousin, yes." He smiled with relief at identifying the proper term, but the smile was short-lived. "Not here. In Chicago. But here." He waved his arms to encompass the entire United States. I call him, tell him I am good." "But you could have done that from here," I said. The distress returned. "You are very nice, but you are with Mr. Nelson." "You mean we're with the CIA? Well, yes, but not entirely." He once again appeared to be confused, for which I couldn't blame him. "Never mind," said Mother. "Yes, we're with them." "So what?" I said. "Mr. Nelson must not know I do this." "Why?" said Peter. James struggled to put it into our language. "Mr. Nelson say no person must know where I am for me to be safe. But I want my cousin to know I am good." "Did you tell him where you are?" Peter asked. No, just that I am good." "Ah," said Mother. "Well, that explains that, doesn't it?" She casually resumed eating, and after an uncomfortable pause, the rest of us did too. I was surprised that Mother seemed so satisfied, because I certainly wasn't. James' explanation was plausible, but my feelings about him kept getting thrown into reverse, and it was going to take a little while for me to shift gears again. For his part, James hadn't exactly dived back into his meal with his usual gusto. He pushed the eggs around his plate with his fork before finally scooping up a bit of them and putting them in his mouth. In my present frame of mind, it seemed to me that he was eating guiltily. Then again, he could have just been worried that we would tell Nelson what he'd done. I watched Mother as she ate her eggs, raising her fork to her mouth with the steady rhythm of a well-trafficked automatic door. I got the feeling she wasn't quite as satisfied as I first thought. I sighed inwardly. Nelson had been right. James' presence had severely disrupted our home life, if for no other reason than that we couldn't readily discuss our problems with each other while he was there, especially since he was our problem. I suppose that would teach us to bring our work home. Mother suddenly dropped her fork on her plate and said, "That was lovely, though I say it myself. I'll just start clearing up." She rose from her chair with her plate in hand. "I help," said James, starting to get up. "Don't be silly," Mother said pleasantly. "You haven't finished yet. Alex will help me." "I will," I said with surprise, a forkful of eggs poised at my lips. She eyed me significantly. "You're done, aren't you?" "I guess I am." I put down my fork and got up. I glanced at James and added, "Watching my figure, you know." His big brown eyes blinked at me. "Hmm?" "I'll explain," said Peter with a smirk as I followed Mother from the room to the sink. She turned on the tap and started rinsing off her plate. Peter kept James talking while Mother and I had a conversation covered by the rushing water and whispered at such a low level that I could barely hear her myself. "Bloody awkward with I'm always underfoot," she said. "What do you think?" "I don't know what to think." "I don't either. I'd like to believe him, but you were in a 2 and 6 over that phone call." "Yeah, what should we do?" She took my plate from me, and I watched sadly as she scraped the remaining half of my breakfast into the garbage disposal. "I think when Peter is leaving for work, you should tell him to call home when he gets there." "What?" "Shh," she said with a glance over her shoulder. "Just a little diversion." She switched off the tap and went back to the table. Like any dutiful son, I obeyed my mother and gave my husband a big wet kiss at the door, then whispered in his ear, "Call us the minute you get to work." He drew back and looked me in the eye. "What? Why?" I don't know." "Just do it," I whined softly. He shrugged resignedly. "All right." Soon after Peter left, Nelson, Dunning, and Bagnall arrived. They immediately went to work at the dining table with James, whose spirits dulled at the very sight of them. It was beginning to look like a board meeting that had gone on too long. Mother announced that she and I would be busy cleaning the second floor, which elicited a disinterested nod from the agents. She led me upstairs to her room. "You never said anything about cleaning today," I said as I sat on the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. "We're not, darling. It's part of the diversion. I wanted to be up here when Peter calls so we can talk to him privately without arousing suspicion." "To Peter?" I asked, totally baffled. "No, you nit, to Larry." "You wanted Peter to call so you could talk to Nelson?" "Yes," she said happily, as if that explained it all. When she noticed my expression, she added, "Well, I couldn't very well ask him for a private chat in front of everyone. It would be noticed." "Of course you could. You've already hauled him into the kitchen to give him a dressing down." "Yes, in the kitchen, but this talk has to be somewhere where there's no possibility of our being overheard, and I can't very well say, 'Larry, darling, could you pop up to the bedroom for a chat? And we do need to talk to him.'" "About what?" "About what?" she repeated, giving it the want pronunciation of an incredulous Englishwoman. "About the phone call. Honestly, darling, sometimes you're dreadfully slow." "You mean you still think we should tell him about it?" She folded her arms, and I had the feeling we were on the verge of an argument, even though I didn't really know how I felt about telling Nelson. "Of course. Why shouldn't we?" "Didn't you believe James? About his cousin, I mean." She heaved a frustrated sigh. "It's hard to tell. The explanation wasn't exactly quick to his lips, but then nothing in English would be, would it? If you don't know, then why bother Nelson with it? It'll only cause trouble for James." "Larry said that if you took him out, you should report anything unusual. I think his making a casual phone call from a gay bar falls into the category, don't you? Yes, but... But what? Well, I said slowly, it's just that I think James trusts us. If we do this, we're bound to ruin that. She pursed her lips. He didn't trust us enough to tell us he wanted to make a call, did he? There's trust, and then there's trust. I don't think he's in a position to put his full trust in anybody. And what he said is probably true. I mean, if he was really just calling his cousin that he's afraid of getting in trouble with Nelson. I know, she said, sitting beside me and giving my leg a pat. And it does go against the grain. The idea of telling Larry the truth, I mean. Well, you know what I mean, but I do think we should do it. This could be very serious, and if it is, we should do something about it before we're in over our heads. I shook my head sadly. I just don't like the idea of betraying his trust. Mother tilted her head to one side and displayed a sly smile. Then we'll just have to be careful with Larry, won't we? I didn't have time to ask her what she meant by that, because we were interrupted by the ringing of the phone. Mother went to the princess phone on her nightstand and picked up the receiver. Hello? Oh, hello, darling. Thank you very much for calling. She started to hang up, then put the receiver back to her ear at the sound of Peter's voice. What? Oh, no. I just needed the phone to ring. Bye, love. She replaced the receiver and turned to me. Now, go down and tell Larry he has a phone call. Okay. As I went down the hallway, I mentally kicked myself for only just realizing why Mother had wanted Peter to call. I then mentally kicked her for allowing the government's penchant for needlessly sneaky tactics to rub off on her. I went halfway down the stairs and leaned over the banister. The four of them were huddled over a map, and James had his index finger firmly fixed on a spot in its center while he said something to Bagnald in Arabic. Nelson, there's someone on the phone for you, I said. Thank you, he replied after a pause. I'll take it in the kitchen. No, I exclaimed, causing the other three to look up. I mean, you might want to take it up there. There's more privacy. Very well. He followed me up the stairs and down the hall to Mother's room. She closed the door, giving it a little tap, as if that would strengthen its seal. There isn't really anyone on the phone, she explained. We just needed a word with you in private. Yes, I realized that when Alex told me I had a call, he said without inflection. What? I said. How'd you know? First, because no one knows I'm here, and second, because I carry a cell phone, and anyone who would be calling me has the number. Then why'd you say you'd take it in? My mouth fell open, and I slowly dropped onto the cedar chest. Oh my God, you were putting me on. Why are you so shocked? Because I didn't know you had a sense of humor, I replied accusingly, as if he'd willfully been hiding it from me all these years. He turned back to Mother. So, you had something you wanted to discuss? Well, I'm afraid it's rather delicate, she said, joining her hands together and touching them to her lips. Do you think we can confide in you without you getting all shirty about it? That depends on what it is. No, really, Nelson, I said. We need to know if we can tell you something that you'll feel like doing something about without you doing something about it. Mm-hmm, he said, looking at me with a slightly puzzled frown. Once again, that depends on what it is. You really never will give us an inch, will you? I said disgustedly. Yeah, I know, I said. And it doesn't help to know that the eager little black Labrador with the big sad eyes and the wagging tail may be the very one that'll turn on you. Yeah, I know, I repeated after a pause to worry about her sanity. Mother and I had lunch with James in the kitchen. He kept up a surprisingly string of chatter about the previous night and what he thought of the freedom of Americans, particularly homosexual Americans. He seemed mindless at this restrained response he was receiving from us. Mother watched him with cautious interest, her peerless scrutiny trying to divine whether or not he was genuine. We were both waiting for the same thing, while hoping it wouldn't happen. When lunch was over and James had gone back to work with the agents without mentioning the bar, we were still too apprehensive to be relieved. "We still have another meal to get through," Mother said as we washed the lunch dishes. "And another evening," I added. "A good job. He's leaving tomorrow. I do feel for the boy, but honestly, I'd like to think Larry's wrong, but his attitude this morning didn't exactly inspire confidence, did it?" "I hate to say I told you so." She cut me off. "Oh, no, you don't." I ignored her. "But didn't I say from the start that I thought Nelson was up to something?" "Yes, you did, darling," she replied in her placating, the child tone as she handed me a plate to dry. "You'll be able to take that knowledge to your grave." "I hope not." While Peter changed after work that evening, I filled him in on what had transpired with Nelson and what the rest of the day had been like. "James never asked about going back to the bar?" Peter asked as he buttoned his jeans. "Not a word. The day's not over yet, though." He silently donned a purple t-shirt, tucked it into his pants, and then shook his head. "I knew it. I knew Nelson had something up his sleeve." "If I remember correctly, I was the one who knew it. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but every time we got involved in one of these cases, you and Mother always throw it up at me that I was the one who got us into it. I just wanted on the record that this time I was the one reluctant to do it, and you were the one who thought we should go ahead." He smiled at me. "It's duly noted." His tone was so exactly like Mother's had been earlier that I suddenly realized with a sinking feeling that the old adage is true. Men really do marry their mothers. "Of course," he added as we headed down the hallway, "the whole situation never would have come up if you hadn't gotten us involved with the CIA in the first place." Following behind him, I swung back with my palm and gave him a stinging slap on the ass. He burst out laughing. Dinner was even more strained than lunch had been. Listening to Mother carrying on polite conversation with a potential enemy spy was like watching a balloon being slowly overinflated and waiting for it to burst. When the tension got to be too much for her, she decided to stick a pin in the balloon herself. "So," she said broadly, "what do you boys intend to do this evening?" "I don't know," I said to my plate. "I haven't given it any thought." I hope," James started tentatively, then broke off in an apparent loss for words. Mother, Peter, and I froze with forks halfway to our mouths and watched him. He tried again. "I hope we could go back to bar?" "To Charlene's," said Peter. "Yes. There's a lot of gay bars in town," I said carefully. "Why don't we try a different one?" "I like this one," he replied eagerly. "There's a whole world out there. You shouldn't limit yourself to one place." He blinked his big brown eyes at me. "I tell Bob I go back." "You did?" He nodded. "He asked if he see me again. I say I come back tonight. I try to." Mother, Peter, and I looked at each other. We all seemed equally disheartened. "Okay," I said at last. "Fine. We'll take you there then." A cloud of concern crossed James' face. "This is all right?" "Oh, yes, of course." I tried to sound jaunty. Mother told us that we would have to take a cab to the bar because she had promised to take our neighbor, Maddie, to pick up something at some store that evening, but I barely heard her. I was trying to convince myself that this was another innocent action on James' part, and that he wanted to go back to the bar purely out of the desire to repeat an enjoyable experience. But I couldn't get myself to believe it. Nelson had called this one, so it now seemed clear that James was really up to something, and so was Nelson. We left for the bar at 7:45, with Mother waving us off from the front door. Only this time she looked like a mother whose only half-witted child was going off to war and could be guaranteed never to return. Finding a cab was no problem, since Fullerton, the street on which our townhouse is located, is a major thoroughfare, even in the dead of night with no visible traffic. All you have to do is walk to the curb and raise your hand, and a cab will materialize out of nowhere. On the way to the bar, James kept himself plastered to the side window, like a golden retriever watching the world go by. Peter sat silently beside me with his jaw set, like a steel trap, and his right leg solidly pressed against mine. None of us spoke. I had twisted this situation around in my mind until I could barely think. At that point, the only thing going through my head was that damned marching music from the old Flash Gordon serials, the music that played while soldiers marched endlessly through caves. As we got out of the cab in front of the bar, I reminded myself that Nelson really wouldn't ever purposely put us in danger. Purposely, and I reminded myself that he was having us watched so we'd have backup. Another word that stuck in my throat, given the dire situations it's used in the movies. And I reminded myself that this was a crowded public place, so it didn't seem there was a lot that could happen. Of course, if I'd been able to share these thoughts with Peter, he would have accused me of having a very convenient memory. I sighed and opened the door. Peter and James followed me in. A sinister haze hung in the air of the bar. Actually, it was the usual thick cloud of cigarette smoke. It just seemed sinister under the circumstances. It's amazing how a potential government sting can alter your perception. The people on the dance floor are gyrating with their usual fervor, but to me they appear to undulate like the ripples in hot air, and the music took on a hallucinatory echo. The people scattered around the small tables didn't seem quite as Aryan as usual. They all looked dark and shifty-eyed, and appeared to be taking special notice of our entrance. It was like being in a Middle Eastern production of Cabaret. There were no stools available at the bar, so we were forced to stand grouped at the end of it, which left me feeling out in the open despite the crowd. James was very interested in the dancers and the other patrons, but it didn't seem like the naive awe he'd shown the night before. He was looking for someone. I could feel it. Of course, that someone could have just been Bob. When Ernie had a second, he came to the end of the bar. 2 nights in a row, he said. Where's that cutie pie of yours? Right here, I said, motioning to James's back. James turned around and Ernie shot him a lascivious grin. Hi there. Hi, James replied. 3 beers, Ernie asked him. Yep. The anonymous techno-pop music that had been blaring since we came in subsided, segueing into Smooth Operator. The colored lights that speckled the dancers slowed in accompaniment. Once Ernie returned with the beers, Peter paid him and I handed a bottle to James, who drank half of it, down in one gulp, as he continued to scan the crowd. Even with his vigilance, I saw Bob approaching before he did. If I hadn't been so nervous, I would have smiled. Bob had gotten dressed up for his new friend. He was wearing white pants and white shirt, over which he sported a loose-fitting, fringed vest. He looked like a loaf of Wonder Bread in a suede sheath. Hi, he said over the music. You're back. Yes, hello, James replied. Bob jockeyed for a position at the bar and called to Ernie for a beer. In the time it took him to get served, the music changed again. This time it was Wanna Be Starting Something, a song that would have tap danced on my last exposed nerve in the best situations. But then and there it seemed uncomfortably appropriate. The colored lights sprang back to life, picking up speed along with everyone on the crowded dance floor. In a matter of seconds, the entire bar had become a swirly mass of ear-shattering noise and movement. I heard Bob yell, I didn't think you would make it, James said. Yes, and downed the rest of his beer. It was then that I noticed the man who had just come in. He had short black hair and dark tan skin. He was wearing a black shirt and blue jeans under an unbuttoned calf-length overcoat. But it wasn't his appearance that caught my eye. It was that he was heading in a beeline from the front door across the dance floor, straight for James. Without a pause in their gyrating, the dancers parted to let him pass. I nudged Peter and motioned to the stranger. James had been giving most of his attention to Bob, and was the last of our trio to notice the new arrival. When he did, he tensed up noticeably, exactly as he did when faced with the agents at our house. Bob finally turned to see what James was looking at and stepped back in surprise when the stranger wedged himself purposely between them without giving Bob a glance. The man said something to James, presumably in Arabic, and James answered in such a halting fashion he sounded almost as if his command of his native tongue was as bad as his English. Bob slunk back a few steps, apparently realizing that he'd been effectively cut out, but he continued to pay attention from a discreet distance, looking for any sign that he could insinuate himself back into James's attention. If I could have spared the energy, I would have felt sorry for him. James and the newcomer continued to speak to each other in a manner I can only describe as fervent. Then the stranger glanced over James's shoulder toward the hall to the bathroom. He said something else, then with a sidelong look at me, James turned and started for the doorway. "Jesus," I said to Peter. "What do we do?" To my complete surprise, I heard Ernie yell, "Hey!" Above the din, he plunged halfway across the bar between two of the seated patrons, caught the stranger by the shoulders, and yanked him backwards. It was then that in my head all sound stopped and everything went into slow motion. I was startled by the sudden attack, but not so startled that I failed to see that Bob was pulling a gun out of his vest for reasons I'll never understand. I suddenly had an image of James the way he'd been when I'd watched him napping, all curled up in fetal position, and the words "tuck and roll" flashed through my brain. Without thinking, I dropped to the floor as I grabbed my knees and rolled sideways toward Bob like a badly lopsided human bowling ball. Though he was only a few feet away, I managed to hit the legs with enough force that he flipped forward. Then all hell broke loose. I came to rest at the edge of the dance floor, but not before nailing two of the dancers in a 7-10 split. I had sent Bob sprawling into one of the bar stools from which he was having some difficulty extricating himself. Since he appeared to have lost his gun, I was stunned when I heard shots. Screams rang out as the crowd broke into a stampede, sending tables, bottles, and glasses shattering onto the floor. And still the shots continued. It was a matter of seconds before I realized where they were coming from. The stranger was on top of the bar, firing off to his right while people fled in all directions. In the midst of the pandemonium, the stranger leapt from the bar and started for the back hallway, but before he reached the doorway, Bob rolled out onto the floor across the broken glass. He'd recovered his gun and was holding it in his outstretched right hand. Without a word, he opened fire. The stranger convulsed, his back arching, then wheeled around, wavering like a drunk. He pointed his gun down at his assailant, but before he could pull the trigger, he froze for a split second, then crumpled to the floor. Bob heaved a sigh of relief. After a moment, he turned his face to me. "I hope you realize what you've done," he said. James was nowhere in sight. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.